It was 1876 in the Colorado Territory, a land carved from rock and ambition, and Senator William Carpenter was about to burn an empire to the ground. He hunched over a polished oak table in Denver's Grand Palace Hotel, the golden light of a chandelier spilling across the papers in front of him. These weren't just papers. They were dynamite. Land deeds, forged documents, records of bribes paid and lives ruined. He pushed a leather portfolio across the table to the young reporter sitting opposite him. The man, James Reed, was thin, with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that seemed too large for his nervous face. "It's all here," the senator whispered, his voice a low rumble. "Proof that the Transcontinental Railroad isn't just building a track. They're stealing a nation." Reed's eyes darted toward the door. "Are you sure about this, Senator? Sherman Wade is a war hero. He's one of the most powerful men in Colorado." The senator's eyes, weathered by years of political fights, turned to steel. "War heroes can become tyrants when no one is watching, son. Wade fought for the Union? Yes, but what he's doing now, forcing families from their homes, breaking treaties with the Ute, it betrays every drop of blood we spilled for this country." He had spent 2 long years gathering this evidence, 2 years of secret meetings, of threats, of looking over his shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, a note of finality in his voice, "I present this to the governor, and Wade's empire comes to an end." But neither man noticed the door to the adjoining room was cracked open. Neither man saw the pair of bright blue eyes peering through that crack. Sarah Carpenter, the senator's 26-year-old daughter, stood frozen, her hand pressed to her chest, her heart hammering like a drum. She had her father's stubborn chin and her late mother's golden hair, and she was listening to every single word. She heard her father's plan. She heard the name Sherman Wade. And then she heard the window shatter. The sound of breaking glass was instantly swallowed by the deafening crack of a gunshot. Senator Carpenter jerked backward, a crimson flower blooming on the crisp white of his shirt. The reporter, Reed, screamed and toppled his chair, scrambling away from the table like a frightened crab. "Father!" Sarah screamed, bursting into the room. The senator slumped forward, his blood pooling on the very papers that were meant to bring a tyrant to justice. His eyes, clouded with pain, found his daughter's. His lips moved, forming a single, desperate word. "Run!" A second shot splintered the doorframe, missing Sarah's head by inches. Through the shattered window, she saw a dark figure retreating across the rain-slicked hotel roof. Her mind went blank with terror, but her father's training took over. "If anything happens to me, trust no one. Get the evidence to the governor yourself." With trembling hands, she snatched the leather portfolio from the table. She clutched it to her chest as she fled into the hallway, Reed's terrified screams for help echoing behind her. She knew better than to wait, better than to trust anyone. Her father had made her promise. The service stairs were dark and narrow, leading her to the hotel's rear exit. The moment she stepped outside, the cold Colorado rain soaked her dress, plastering it to her skin. The alley was a dark, wet canyon of brick and mud. She hadn't gone 20 yards when she heard it, heavy footsteps splashing through the puddles behind her. "Stop right there, Miss Carpenter." She didn't stop. She ran. Her boots slipped on the wet cobblestones as she darted through a maze of narrow alleys. The portfolio was tucked tightly under her arm, a lead weight that held the fate of the entire territory. Denver's gaslights blurred into streaks of yellow and orange, but the footsteps behind her never faltered. They were steady, relentless, a predator closing in on its prey. At the edge of town, where the city gave way to the dark, open country, she saw a flicker of hope. A supply wagon, the driver preparing to depart despite the late hour. With the last ounce of her strength, Sarah leaped aboard, burrowing under a heavy canvas tarp just as the wagon rumbled into motion. As the wagon wheels churned through the mud, carrying her away from the city, a sharp, searing pain bloomed in her shoulder. She reached up and her fingers came away, wet and sticky. It was only then, hidden in the darkness beneath the tarp, that she realized the terrible truth. She'd been shot. 50 miles away, Elijah Morgan stood on the porch of his isolated ranch house, watching lightning tear the sky apart over Silver Creek Valley. At 45, his face was as weathered as the landscape itself, etched with lines of sun and sorrow. His eyes had seen too much death to ever grant him a full night's sleep. The rain hadn't reached his land yet, but he could smell it on the wind. The ranch was his sanctuary, a fortress against a world he no longer trusted. A sturdy cabin, a barn, and a few outbuildings, all backed against a dark pine forest with mountains looming like silent giants beyond. It wasn't much to show for a life, but it was his. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the thing he held in his hands. A small wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a Medal of Honor. 11 years. 11 years since Gettysburg. 11 years since a man named Colonel Sherman Wade had dragged him, bleeding and half dead, from a blood-soaked wheat field. Some debts he knew could never truly be repaid. Enough ghosts for one night, Eli muttered to himself, closing the box and stepping back inside the cabin. The interior was sparse but orderly. Weapons hung on the walls, not as trophies but as tools. A shelf of books stood as a testament to the long, solitary winters. There were no photographs on the mantel. He didn't need them. The faces of his dead were burned into his memory. He stoked the fire and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. It was his ritual. 1 drink before bed, enough to dull the edges of his memories, but not enough to unleash the nightmares of battle that sometimes clawed their way out of the bottle. But tonight, something was different. A strange unease prickled at his senses, like the static charge in the air right before a lightning strike. He was halfway through his whiskey when the first raindrop hit the tin roof. Then another, and another. Then, through the growing rhythm of the rain, he heard another sound. It was so faint he almost missed it. A voice, a woman's voice, weak and desperate, carried on the wind from the direction of his storage shed. "Can't breathe." Eli set his glass down, his body going rigid. He listened, straining his ears. Nothing but the wind and the rain. Had he imagined it? The war had left him with more than just physical scars. Sometimes his mind played tricks on him, conjuring voices from the graves of his past. Then he heard it again, weaker this time, almost a whisper. "Please, can't breathe." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his Colt revolver from the mantel and a lantern from the wall. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, driven sideways by a gusting wind. He crossed the muddy yard to the storage shed, the cold water streaming from the brim of his hat. He pushed the creaking door open, the lantern light cutting through the darkness. Everything looked normal. Tools hanging on the walls, sacks of grain, crates of supplies. Nothing seemed out of place. But as he raised the lantern higher, he saw it. A canvas tarp in the corner. It moved, just a little, as if something beneath it was struggling for air. He approached cautiously, his revolver raised. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He reached down, grabbed the edge of the heavy rain-soaked tarp, and pulled it back, and his blood ran cold. Beneath it lay a young woman. Her golden hair was matted with blood and dirt, her face as pale as a ghost. Her chest barely moved. The right shoulder of her dress was soaked in a dark, ugly stain. "Jesus Christ," Eli breathed, holstering his gun and kneeling beside her. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were bright blue but clouded with pain and fear. She tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "Easy now," Eli said, his voice softer than he'd used in years. "I've got you." He gathered her into his arms. She felt impossibly light, as fragile as a bird. But just as he stood up, a branch snapped in the darkness, just beyond the circle of his lantern light. Eli froze. He listened. The rain hammered down, but beneath it, he could feel it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. He squinted into the impenetrable darkness, but he couldn't see anything beyond the curtain of rain. When he looked back down at the woman, her eyes had closed again. Fresh blood was seeping through her dress, warm and wet against his arm. Whoever was out there in the dark would have to wait. This woman was dying. Eli carried her through the downpour to his cabin, kicking the door shut behind him. He laid her gently on his bed, the only soft place in the entire house. As he worked to remove her soaked jacket, something fell from an inner pocket. It was a newspaper clipping, damp and smudged with mud. He paused, his hand still on her jacket, and glanced at the headline. "Senator Carpenter assassinated in Denver." Eli's eyes shot from the paper to the unconscious woman's face. The resemblance was undeniable, even through the dirt and the blood. The stubborn chin, the golden hair. This was Sarah Carpenter, the senator's daughter, and if she was here 50 miles from Denver, wounded and alone, it meant one thing. Trouble wasn't far behind. As if to confirm his thoughts, one of his horses let out a nervous whinny from the barn. Eli moved to the window, peering out into the storm. He couldn't see anything in the blackness, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. It was a feeling he'd learned to trust on the battlefield. It was a feeling that had kept him alive. He returned to Sarah's side, carefully cutting away the blood-soaked fabric around her shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through. A small mercy. He cleaned the wound as best he could and bandaged it tightly. As he worked, Sarah stirred, murmuring in a delirious fever. "Father, the evidence must reach the governor." "Easy," Eli soothed, though his own mind was racing. Everyone in Colorado knew Senator Carpenter had been investigating railroad corruption. If his daughter was carrying evidence important enough to get her father killed. Sarah's eyes suddenly flew open, locking onto his face with a shocking clarity. "Denver," she gasped. "I need to get to Denver. The governor—" "You're not going anywhere tonight," Eli said firmly. "You've lost a lot of blood, and there's a hell of a storm raging." Fear flashed across her face. Pure, undiluted terror. She tried to sit up, but fell back with a pained groan. "You don't understand. They'll come for me. For the journal." "Who's they?" Eli asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Before she could respond, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Eli finished bandaging her wound and covered her with a heavy wool blanket. He picked up the newspaper clipping again, reading it more carefully this time. The article mentioned the senator's crusade against corrupt business interests, but it didn't name any specific targets. As he went to fold the clipping, he noticed something on the back. A note, hastily scrawled in pencil. "Wade knows. Trust no one." The name hit him like a physical blow. Sherman Wade, the name that conjured memories of cannon smoke and blood, of a battlefield littered with the dead and dying. The name of the man who had reached down and pulled him from death's embrace. "I owe you my life, Colonel," he had told Wade in the field hospital, his own voice weak and raspy. "Then live it well, Captain Morgan," Wade had replied, his face grim but resolute. "We've survived this hell to build this country from the ashes." Now, 11 years later, that same name was tied to the assassination of a senator and a wounded woman who had mysteriously appeared on his ranch. The debt he thought he understood suddenly felt like a chain tightening around his neck. He didn't just owe Wade his life. Wade had given him this ranch. After the war, when Eli was lost in a sea of whiskey and grief, it was Judge Carpenter, Sarah's father, who had given him a chance at a clean slate. But it was Wade's influence that had secured the land deed, a final act of patronage from his old commander. This land, this sanctuary, it was all tied to Sherman Wade. He checked his guns, making sure they were loaded. He dragged a heavy chair to the window, positioning it so he could watch the cabin door and the yard beyond. The storm outside gathered strength, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin. It sounded like the ghosts of Gettysburg, finally coming to collect an old bloody debt. If trouble was coming for Sarah Carpenter, it would have to come through him first. And as he sat there watching the rain and the darkness, a terrible thought began to form in his mind. He'd felt someone watching him from the woods. He had assumed they were hunting for Sarah. But what if they weren't? What if the wagon driver who had brought her here hadn't been a random Good Samaritan? What if he had been one of Wade's men? What if they hadn't just been hunting her? What if they had followed her here? What if this wasn't a refuge at all? What if it was a trap? Dawn broke gray and sullen, the sky choked with clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of mud and broken branches. Eli had dozed in the chair, his sleep fitful and shallow. He rose stiffly and went to check on his guest. Sarah Carpenter's face was flushed with fever, her breathing rapid. The bandage on her shoulder was stained with fresh blood. He placed a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open. "Father," she whispered. "Rest," Eli said, his voice gentler than he was used to. "You're safe for now." Her eyes closed again. He changed her bandage, his brow furrowing with concern. He saw angry red streaks beginning to radiate from the wound. Infection? He'd seen it kill more men during the war than bullets ever had. He mixed a poultice of herbs he'd gathered from the mountainside, an old remedy a Ute woman had taught him years ago. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. As he worked, his mind kept circling back to the note. Wade knows. It was possible Wade was involved in the senator's death. The man had always been ambitious, ruthless even. But a murderer? The man who had saved his life? He needed more than a scribbled note to believe that. After applying the poultice, he stepped outside. The muddy ground confirmed his fears. Boot prints, multiple sets. They circled the cabin, staying just beyond the reach of the porch light. Someone had been watching him all night. Waiting. He returned inside and began gathering supplies. Ammunition, dried meat, medical supplies. He was checking his Winchester repeater when a soft voice came from the bed. "You're him, aren't you? From the photograph." Eli turned. Sarah was watching him, her eyes feverish but surprisingly lucid. "What photograph?" "In my father's study," she said. "A picture of you and Colonel Wade at Gettysburg. The heroes." There was a bitter edge to the way she said the last word. Eli set the rifle down. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long," she said, struggling to sit up. She winced in pain. "My father, he trusted you. He said you were the only honest man in Wade's command." Eli helped prop her up with a folded blanket. "Your father and I met years ago. I was just a girl," she said, her eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "He said if Wade had 10 men like you, he might have become a force for good. Instead of—" She trailed off, a racking cough shaking her small frame. He gave her a cup of water, which she drank gratefully. "Your father was investigating Wade," he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, then reached for her jacket, which he'd hung near the fire to dry. "There's something inside the lining, a journal, my father's record of everything." Eli retrieved the jacket. He felt a small, hard object sewn into the lining. He carefully cut it free. It was a small, leather-bound notebook. He handed it to her. "It's in code," she explained, her fingers tracing the pages filled with seemingly random letters and numbers. "Only my father and I knew how to read it. It documents everything, the bribes, the forced land sales, the treaty violations with the Ute." She looked up at him, her blue eyes burning with a feverish fire. "Wade is building an empire on stolen land and broken laws. The railroad is just the beginning. And your father was going to expose him to the governor." "Yes," she said, her voice catching. "Wade must have found out. He sent a man named Hawkins, to kill him." Her composure finally broke, and tears welled in her eyes. "I saw him, through the window. I saw him shoot my father. I took the journal and I ran." Eli's jaw tightened. John Hawkins, another ghost from Gettysburg, a lieutenant who had followed Wade's orders with a brutal, unquestioning loyalty. "I have to get to the governor," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "Before Wade realizes I have the journal." "You're in no condition to travel," Eli said flatly. "That wound is infected. You need to rest." "There's no time. Wade will have to come through me first," Eli interrupted. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. He hadn't intended to get involved. He had spent years building walls around his life, avoiding the very kind of trouble that was now sitting on his bed. Sarah studied him, her gaze penetrating. "Why would you help me? You owe Wade your life. Everyone knows that story." The question hit him harder than a bullet. Why? He owed Wade everything. His life, this land, this quiet solitude he cherished. And yet, he also owed a debt to her father. Judge Carpenter had found him in a jail cell after a drunken brawl, a broken man drowning his sorrows. Instead of sending him to prison, the judge had given him a second chance. He had helped Eli secure this very land. "I owe Wade for pulling me from that field," Eli said slowly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But if he's behind your father's murder, that debt is paid." He paused, the weight of his next words settling heavily in the small cabin. Besides, I owe your father too. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. That's why he trusted you. Why he kept that photograph. Eli just nodded, moving back to the window. He scanned the tree line, the feeling of being watched returning with a vengeance. We can't stay here, he decided. My monthly supply run to Silver Creek is due. No one would question me riding into town. I can send a telegram to the governor from there. I'm coming with you, she insisted. You can barely stand. I'll manage, she said, her jaw set with a familiar stubbornness. The journal stays with me. Before Eli could argue, he saw it. A flash of metal by the barn, the morning sun glinting off a rifle barrel. He moved in an instant, pushing Sarah back down into the bed. Don't move, he whispered. He grabbed his Winchester, positioning himself beside the window, just out of sight. Through a small gap in the curtains, he watched as a single rider emerged from the tree line. The man wore a long duster coat, his wide-brimmed hat pulled down low. He circled the yard once, his eyes studying the ground. He dismounted by the storage shed, examining the area where Eli had found Sarah. Then he remounted and rode directly toward the cabin, stopping 30 yards from the porch. Morgan, the rider called out. I know you're in there, and I know who you're hiding. Eli's grip tightened on his rifle. What do you want? He yelled back. Just a conversation about old times and new troubles. Identify yourself. The rider pushed his hat back, revealing a face Eli hadn't seen in 11 years, but would never forget. It was John Hawkins, older now with a nasty scar running from his temple to his jaw that hadn't been there during the war. Lieutenant Hawkins, Eli acknowledged, his voice cold as ice. Captain Morgan, Hawkins replied with a mocking salute. Been too long. Not long enough. Hawkins chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Still the same old Morgan. Listen, I'm here on behalf of an old friend. Colonel Wade sends his regards. Beside Eli, Sarah had risen silently from the bed to peer through the window. Her face went pale at the sight of Hawkins. That's him, she whispered, her voice shaking. That's the man who killed my father. Eli placed a steadying hand on her arm. Stay back, he murmured, then raised his voice to address Hawkins again. What does Wade want? Just what belongs to him, Hawkins' voice hardened. The Carpenter girl, and whatever she stole. Don't make this difficult, Morgan. Wade hasn't forgotten what he did for you at Gettysburg. He's calling in the debt. The words hit Eli like a punch to the gut. The moment he had dreaded for years was here. The day his debt to Wade would become a noose. The woman is injured, Eli called back, stalling for time. She needs a doctor, not a hangman. Wade will make sure she gets all the care she needs. You have my word. Your word? Eli couldn't keep the contempt from his voice. I saw what your word did to Senator Carpenter. Hawkins' hand drifted toward his pistol. Careful, Morgan. That sounds an awful lot like an accusation. Take it how you will. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. Wade respects you, Morgan, Hawkins said finally. That's why I came alone, as a courtesy. But if you don't hand over the girl and whatever she's carrying by sundown, others will come, many others. He reached into his coat and pulled something out. It was an arrow fletched with the markings of a Ute warrior. He threw it onto the ground in front of the cabin. And not just Wade's men, Hawkins added, the threat hanging heavy in the air. Somehow Wade had turned the Ute against their own treaties, against their own interests. It was a devastating move, an alliance that would make an isolated ranch impossible to defend. Sundown, Morgan, Hawkins repeated, turning his horse. For old time's sake, I hope you make the right choice. As Hawkins rode away, disappearing back into the trees, Eli lowered his rifle. He looked at Sarah, her face pale, her body racked with fever. He looked at the Ute arrow lying in the mud. He thought of the debt he owed Wade, and the debt he owed her father. He had until sundown to choose a side. But as he looked at the quiet determination in Sarah's eyes, he knew he had already made his choice. He just didn't know if either of them would live to see the next sunrise. The mountain trail was a treacherous ribbon of rock and mud, twisting like a wounded snake up the side of the peak. Eli rode ahead, his Winchester resting across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Sarah followed on his gentlest mare, her face a mask of pain, but her back ramrod straight. They had left the ranch less than an hour after Hawkins' departure, taking only what was essential: weapons, food, medical supplies, and the journal, now hidden deep inside Sarah's coat. Eli knew the high country was their only chance. Wade's men would expect them to make a run for Denver on the main road. No one would expect them to take such a brutal path, not with a wounded woman, but the thin air and rough terrain were taking their toll. Twice Sarah had swayed dangerously in the saddle, and Eli had to grab her arm to keep her from falling. "We'll rest here," he announced, pulling his horse to a stop on a small plateau sheltered by a stand of ancient pines. It offered a clear view of the trail behind them, but kept them hidden from below. Sarah slid from her horse, her legs nearly buckling. Eli caught her, feeling the heat of her fever through her clothes. "The infection's getting worse," he said, his voice grim. "I've had worse," she managed to say, though her voice was barely a whisper. A small smile touched Eli's lips. "Have you now?" "Perhaps not," she admitted, "but I imagine you have." While Sarah rested against a tree, Eli built a small, smokeless fire, using an old soldier's trick to hide it from prying eyes. The mountain air was cold and Sarah needed the warmth. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, laced with a splash of whiskey for the pain. "Your father," Eli said, breaking the silence. "He raised you alone?" Sarah nodded, cradling the warm cup in her trembling hands. "My mother died when I was 12. He believed a woman deserved the same education as a man. He hired tutors, encouraged me to study law, politics." A shadow of sadness crossed her face. He was an unconventional man. After the war, he became obsessed with rooting out corruption. He said we didn't fight to save the Union, just to let a new kind of greed tear it apart from the inside. "He was right about that," Eli said, poking the fire with a stick. "He spoke of you sometimes," Sarah continued, her eyes watching him over the rim of her cup. "He said you were one of the few men under Wade's command who questioned orders when they crossed a line." Eli felt a familiar discomfort tighten his shoulders. "Your father gave me more credit than I deserved." "Did he?" Her gaze was sharp, even through the haze of fever. "Is that why you're helping me now? A guilty conscience?" The question cut deeper than she could possibly know. He had spent years trying to bury his conscience, to forget the things he had done under Wade's command. "Let's just say I've seen enough good men die for bad causes," he said finally, getting up to check their back trail. From their perch on the mountainside, he could see for miles. No sign of pursuit. Not yet, but they had left a clear trail. An experienced tracker like Hawkins would find them eventually. When he returned, Sarah had her father's journal open, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You can actually read that?" he asked. She nodded. "My father and I developed the cipher together. It was our secret language." Her finger traced a line of numbers and letters. "This section details Wade's first land grabs after the war. Forged documents, bribed county clerks. Was that enough to get your father killed?" "No," she said, turning a few pages. "This is." Her voice hardened. "It's evidence of Wade's negotiations with certain Ute bands. He's promising them land rights and protection, while at the same time filing claims on that very same land through his railroad company. When the railroad goes through, any Ute who resist will be branded as hostiles, giving the army an excuse to move in and wipe them out." Eli's jaw clenched. It was a classic, brutal strategy. Create a problem, then solve it with violence, all while profiting from the outcome. "There's more," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Wade has powerful investors back east, senators, judges. My father discovered that Wade has been blackmailing some of them to ensure their support. That explains the urgency," Eli said. "He's not just protecting his railroad, he's protecting a whole network of corruption." "And this journal," Sarah said, tapping the small book, "names every single one of them." The snap of a twig from the forest below made them both freeze. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand, motioning for Sarah to be silent. He moved to the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the dense woods. For a long, tense minute, there was nothing. Then he saw it, a flash of color between the trees, too deliberate for an animal. "We need to move," he whispered, returning to Sarah. "Now." They doused the fire and mounted their horses, Sarah biting her lip to keep from crying out in pain. Instead of following the trail, Eli led them higher, into the rocky, treacherous terrain where their tracks would be harder to follow. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice weak. "There's an old, abandoned mining camp a few miles north," Eli replied. "We can hide there until dark, then try to make it to Silver Creek under the cover of night." They rode in silence, the tension a palpable thing between them. Eli kept glancing back, catching occasional glimpses of riders far below, following their general direction. They were being hunted, systematically. As they crested a ridge, Sarah gasped. Eli followed her gaze. Below them, nestled in a small valley, a column of thick black smoke rose into the clear mountain air. It was coming from a small settlement of homesteads. "What is that place?" Sarah asked. Eli's face darkened. "Homesteaders. Swedish immigrants. They arrived last spring." They didn't need to discuss it. He turned his horse, and they began the steep descent toward the burning settlement. As they got closer, the full horror of the scene became clear. Cabins were smoldering ruins. Fences were torn down. Livestock had been slaughtered where they stood, and there were bodies. "Stay here," Eli ordered as they reached the edge of the settlement, dismounting with his rifle ready. "No," Sarah said, her voice firm as she slid from her horse. "I need to see. I need to know exactly what kind of man we're fighting." It was a charnel house. Men, women, children, lying where they had fallen. This wasn't a fight. It was a massacre. "This was a message," Eli said quietly, his voice thick with a cold fury he hadn't felt since the war. "A message for anyone who dares to stand in Wade's way." A faint cough drew their attention to one of the partially collapsed cabins. Eli moved forward cautiously, motioning for Sarah to stay back. Inside, an old man was trapped beneath a fallen timber, his white beard stained with blood. Eli knelt beside him. "Water!" He called to Sarah, and she quickly brought the canteen. After a few sips, the old man grabbed Eli's sleeve, his eyes wild with pain and grief. In a halting, raspy voice, he told them what had happened. Men had come at dawn. Some white men, some Ute warriors. They demanded the settlers leave. When they refused, the killing started. Their leader, the old man wheezed, a tall man with a scar on his face, they called him Colonel. Eli and Sarah exchanged a horrified look. Wade. Wade himself had led this attack. "He promised us justice," the old man gasped, his eyes finding Sarah's. "Your father, the senator, he was here 2 weeks ago. He promised he would stop them." His breathing grew ragged. "Too late. Too late now." "Was there anyone else?" Eli asked gently. "Any survivors?" The old man's fingers dug into Eli's arm with surprising strength. "Children, hiding, in the root cellar, Erickson Farm." His eyes looked past them, toward something only he could see. "Promise me, take them to safety." "I promise," Eli said, his voice solemn. The old man's grip relaxed, and with a final shuddering breath, he was gone. They found the Erickson farm on the northern edge of the settlement. The root cellar door was hidden beneath a pile of smoldering debris. Inside, huddled together in the darkness, were 5 children. The oldest was a boy of no more than 12, the youngest, a little girl who could barely walk. They were terrified, silent, their eyes wide with the horrors they had witnessed. "Wade has changed," Eli said quietly to Sarah as they led the traumatized children back toward their horses. "The man I knew in the war was ruthless, but this is monstrous." "Power corrupts," Sarah replied, her face ashen. "And my father was about to take all of his power away." Getting the children out was a new nightmare. The oldest boy, Eric, could ride behind Eli. Sarah, despite her wound, insisted she could hold the smallest girl. The other 3 would have to walk. Silver Creek was still 8 miles away. They would never make it before dark. "We have to risk the main trail," Eli decided. "It's the only way." It was a dangerous choice. The main trail was faster, but it left them completely exposed. They had been traveling for less than an hour when Eric, the boy riding with Eli, suddenly tensed. "Riders," he whispered. Eli pulled them off the trail, hiding them in a thick stand of pines. They watched as a group of riders came into view. 3 white men and 2 Ute scouts. Eli recognized the man in the lead. Samuel Reed, a former sergeant in Wade's company. They were trackers, and they were good. They stopped right where Eli's party had left the trail. One of the Ute scouts dismounted, examining the ground. "Woman still bleeding," the scout announced. "They move slow. They have the children with them now." Reed cursed loudly. "Survivors. The colonel won't be happy about that. Jensen, you ride back. Tell the colonel we've got them. Tell him they're heading for Silver Creek. They've got nowhere else to go." As the riders moved on, Eli let out a slow breath. They were walking into a trap. Silver Creek was no longer a safe haven. It was the place Wade's men were waiting for them. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. Eli looked at the terrified children. He looked at Sarah, her face pale, her strength fading. He looked up at the distant peaks, where the snow glinted in the afternoon sun. Beyond those mountains lay the main territory of the Ute Nation. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. "We change course," he said, his voice firm. "There's a Ute village beyond those mountains. If we can reach it, we might find help." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "The Ute? After what we just saw? Those were renegades bought and paid for by Wade," Eli explained. "The main tribe under Chief Night Sky, they honor their agreements. I have a history with them. It might be enough to save us." "What kind of history?" Sarah asked. Eli looked away, his eyes scanning the mountains. "A complicated one," he said, and as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the valley, they turned their horses away from the trap waiting in Silver Creek and headed toward the one place their hunters would never expect them to go. Straight into the heart of the Ute Nation. Darkness fell like a shroud over the mountains. They traveled through the forest parallel to the main trail, hidden in the deep shadows of the pines. Progress was agonizingly slow. The children were exhausted, and Sarah was fading fast, swaying in the saddle, barely conscious. Eli found a sheltered hollow where a lightning-scarred pine offered a natural lean-to. It would have to do for the night. As he helped Sarah dismount, her legs gave out completely. She collapsed into his arms, her skin burning with fever. He checked her wound. The infection was spreading, the angry red streaks now reaching down her arm. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "You need a doctor," he said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. She managed a weak, wry smile. "Not an option at the moment, is it?" She clutched his arm, her eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "Tell me about Wade. I need to understand him. I need to understand the man who killed my father." Eli's hands stilled as he prepared a fresh poultice. He had spent years trying not to think about Wade, trying to bury the memories. "Sherman Wade," he began slowly, "was the most brilliant officer I ever served under. Fearless, inspiring. Men would have followed him into the gates of hell. Including you." "Especially me," Eli admitted, his voice distant. "I was 24 when the war started, full of ideals. Wade saw something in me, took me under his wing. By the time we got to Gettysburg, I was his most trusted captain." "And then he saved your life." "Yes," Eli said, applying the poultice to her wound. She winced but didn't cry out. "I took a Confederate bayonet at Cemetery Ridge. I would have bled out right there. But Wade, he carried me off the field himself. Under heavy fire, he took a bullet for me. He unconsciously touched his own side. The scar the old Swede mentioned, he got that saving my life." "That creates a powerful bond," Sarah whispered. "After the war, he talked about the future, about building railroads, cities, a new America. His vision, it was compelling. He offered me a place in it." "What happened?" Eli's expression darkened. "His methods, the same tactics he used in the war, he brought them to business. Anyone who stood in his way was an enemy to be crushed. He wanted land for a rail depot in Kansas. A community of farmers refused to sell." He trailed off, the memory still raw. "He did to them what he did to the Swedish settlement," Sarah finished for him. Eli just nodded. "I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I walked away. I came here, thinking I could leave it all behind." He secured the fresh bandage around her shoulder. "Until you showed up." "Do you regret it?" she asked, her gaze steady, searching. "Helping me?" "No," he answered, and the certainty in his own voice surprised him. "Whatever debt I owed Wade, it doesn't justify what he's become." A small voice interrupted them. It was Eric, the oldest of the Swedish children. Mister, are the bad men coming? Eli turned to the boy, his heart aching at the fear in the child's eyes. Not tonight, he said, hoping it was true. Try to sleep. As the boy returned to the others, Eli checked his weapons, preparing for a long, sleepless night on watch. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, took out the journal, working by the faint moonlight to decode more of its contents. It's all here, she said after a while, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and horror. Wade's entire operation. Land deals, bribes, murders, disguised as accidents. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. This is what my father died for. And what you might die for if we don't get you proper care soon, Eli replied, his concern for her overriding everything else. She managed another weak smile. Then we'd better reach your Ute friends quickly, Captain Morgan. The hours crawled by. The children slept fitfully, whimpering in their dreams. Sarah eventually drifted into an exhausted, feverish sleep, the journal clutched tightly to her chest. Eli remained awake, his rifle across his lap, his senses on high alert. It was near midnight when the horses grew restless. They sensed something he couldn't see or hear. He moved silently to the edge of their small camp, his eyes piercing the darkness. And then he saw them, shadows detaching themselves from other shadows. 5 of them, moving with a silent, deadly grace. Ute warriors, their faces painted for battle, surrounding the camp. Eli didn't raise his rifle. That would be suicide. Instead, he stood up slowly, facing the nearest warrior, and spoke in the Ute language he had learned years ago. A language he hadn't used in a decade. I seek passage to the village of Chief Night Sky, he said, his voice steady. I come in peace, with children who need protection. The warriors paused, surprised to hear their tongue spoken by a white man. Their leader stepped forward, the moonlight glinting off the ritual scars on his face. The White Father in Washington sends his soldiers to kill our people, the warrior replied in Ute. Yet you claim to come in peace. I am not the White Father's man, Eli responded. I am Morgan, the one who once stood against his own soldiers to protect your women and children. A flicker of recognition crossed the warrior's eyes. Morgan, he repeated, studying Eli's face. The one they call the ghost soldier. Eli nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. The name was from the incident in Kansas, the day he had finally broken with Wade, the day he had stood between Wade's men in a Ute village, refusing to carry out an order to attack. The warrior's gaze moved past Eli to the sleeping forms of Sarah and the children. These are not your children. Their families were murdered by the men who served Sherman Wade, the railroad chief, Eli explained. This woman fights against Wade. She carries proof of his crimes, but she is wounded. She is sick. The warrior considered this, then spoke rapidly to his companions. After a moment, he turned back to Eli. Chief Night Sky will want to speak with the woman who fights the railroad chief, he said, then made a sharp gesture. You will come with us. The woman cannot travel far, Eli warned. The infection is getting worse. Wildflower will help her, the warrior replied. She is our healer. Eli remembered Wildflower. She had been just a young girl that day in Kansas, the girl whose life he had saved. We will come, Eli agreed. If you give your word, the children will not be harmed. The warrior touched his own chest in a solemn oath. Children are sacred to the people, even the children of our enemies. They will be safe. As Eli turned to wake Sarah, the warrior spoke again, his voice low and urgent. You should know, ghost soldier. The railroad chief has offered many rifles to any warrior who brings him the woman and her papers. Some of our young men, foolish and hungry, have listened to his promises. He glanced meaningfully back into the dark forest. We must move quickly. Others are watching. Eli's blood ran cold. Wade's corruption had spread like a poison, reaching even into the heart of the Ute Nation, turning brother against brother. Their journey to safety had just become a race against betrayal. Behind him, Sarah stirred, her eyes opening to the terrifying sight of painted warriors surrounding their camp. Her hand instinctively moved to clutch the journal hidden in her coat. It's all right, Eli said quietly, trying to reassure her. They're taking us to their village, to safety. Safety? Sarah repeated, her fever-bright eyes wide with disbelief as she looked at the grim-faced warriors. "Is there such a thing anymore, Captain Morgan?" And in that moment, looking at the dark, unforgiving wilderness around them, Eli Morgan had no answer for her. The Ute village was a place out of time, hidden away in a pristine valley that was a secret known only to the people. Dozens of hide lodges and sturdy wooden dwellings were clustered along a stream that sparkled like a silver ribbon in the morning sun. As their party approached, an elderly man emerged to meet them. He was tall and imposing, his face a roadmap of wisdom and hardship. It was Chief Night Sky. The warrior Grey Wolf explained their presence. The chief listened, his dark eyes moving from Eli to the barely conscious Sarah to the terrified Swedish children. "So," he said, his English perfect and precise, "the ghost soldier returns to us." "I seek refuge, Chief Night Sky," Eli said, inclining his head respectfully, "for this woman who fights the man who would steal your land, and for these children whose parents he murdered." "We have heard of this Sherman Wade," Night Sky said, his expression grim. "He sends his men with gifts and promises. Some of our people have been fooled by his silver tongue." Just then Sarah slid from her horse, collapsing in a heap on the ground. She was unconscious, her body burning with fever. "She needs help," Eli urged. Night Sky called out a command, and a woman stepped forward. She was in her late 20s with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet confidence. She knelt beside Sarah, her hands moving with practiced skill as she examined the wound. "The infection is deep," she said, her English as fluent as the chief's. "I will do what I can." Eli stared at her. Wildflower. The young girl he had saved all those years ago had grown into this self-possessed woman. Her eyes met his, and for a moment they were unreadable. "I remember," she said simply, before directing several others to help carry Sarah to her lodge. "First we talk," Chief Night Sky said, stopping Eli from following. "Your woman and the children will be cared for. But you and I have much to discuss." Inside the chief's lodge, surrounded by the tribal elders, the questions came hard and fast. Why should they trust him? Why should they risk Wade's wrath for a white woman and a group of strange children? "You shouldn't trust me because I am a white man," Eli answered, meeting the gaze of each elder in turn. "Judge me by my actions. Judge me by the enemies I have made." He told them everything. About the senator, the journal, the massacre at the Swedish settlement. He explained that the evidence Sarah carried could not only bring Wade to justice, but could also protect their land rights from the railroad. "This woman fights our battle as well as her own," Night Sky acknowledged after a long council. "For this, we will offer her our protection, but your presence here brings great danger." "I understand," Eli said. "As soon as Sarah can travel, we will leave." "The passes to Denver are watched," Night Sky said, shaking his head. "Wade's men are everywhere. But there is another way. We have a white man who lives among us, a doctor. He came here after the war seeking peace. He travels to the white settlements to trade. He could take the journal to the governor for you." It was a risky proposition, entrusting the journal to a complete stranger, but their options were running out. "I would need to meet this man," Eli said. "He returns tomorrow," Night Sky replied. "Until then, rest. You have earned it." Eli found Sarah in Wildflower's lodge, lying on a bed of soft furs. The air was thick with the scent of herbs. "Will she live?" he asked Wildflower. "She is strong," the healer replied, not looking up from her work. "But the fever is also strong. It is a battle that will be fought within her." She finally raised her eyes to his. "You care for this woman." It wasn't a question. "She's fighting for justice," Eli said. "For your people, too." "And you?" Wildflower asked, her gaze steady. "What do you fight for, ghost soldier?" The question hung in the air between them. "Redemption," he admitted, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "For the things I did and the things I failed to do." "The soldiers at the fort used to call you Wade's hammer," she said softly, applying a poultice to Sarah's wound. "They said you followed his orders without question." Eli flinched. "That was a different man." "Was it?" she asked. "The ghost soldier who saved my people. He appeared in an instant, like a spirit stepping from one world to another." "What happened in that moment, Morgan?" What changed you? He had never spoken of that day to anyone, but looking at Wildflower, he found the words. I saw a child, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A child who looked like my son, the son who died of a fever while I was away at war. He swallowed hard, and suddenly I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that we were bringing civilization when all we were bringing was death. Wildflower listened, her expression unreadable. Your woman calls for you in her fever dreams, she said after a long silence. She speaks of her father, of Wade, and of you, the man she believes will bring justice. She overestimates me. Perhaps, Wildflower said, handing him a small clay cup filled with a dark liquid. Or perhaps she sees the man you could be, not just the man you were. He sat by Sarah's side for hours, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Late in the afternoon, her eyes fluttered open. Eli, she whispered, her voice weak. Where are we? In the Ute village, he said, helping her drink the bitter medicine. You're safe. Her hand found his, her skin burning with fever. My father trusted you, she said. I questioned it at first, but now I understand why. Your father didn't know everything about me, he said, looking away. He knew enough, she insisted, her grip tightening. Promise me something, Eli. If I don't survive this. You will, he interrupted, his voice firm. If I don't, she persisted, promise me you'll get the journal to the governor. Promise me the truth will come out. He met her gaze, and in that moment, he felt a bond forged between them, stronger than any debt, stronger than any shared battle. I promise, he said. He checked on the Swedish children, finding them being cared for by a Ute family who had lost their own children to a white man's disease. He finally allowed himself to rest, collapsing onto a pile of furs in a small empty lodge. His sleep was deep and dreamless, but he was jolted awake before dawn by the sound of horses, many horses, moving fast. He grabbed his gun belt and ran outside. The village was in chaos. Warriors were grabbing their weapons. Grey Wolf appeared at his side, his face grim. Rider, he said, from the south, Wade's men. They have surrounded the valley. Someone had betrayed them. Chief Night Sky emerged from his lodge, his face set like stone. They demand we surrender you, the woman, and the journal, he said. Their leader says they will attack at sunrise. Who's their leader? Eli asked, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Is it Wade? Night Sky shook his head. A man named Hawkins, the assassin. He was here, and he had brought an army. Eli ran to Wildflower's lodge. She was already helping a weak but conscious Sarah to her feet. Wade's men have found us, he said bluntly. They've surrounded the village. There is another way out, Wildflower said quickly. A path known only to our healers. It leads north, through the high caves. The plan came together in a frantic rush. Grey Wolf and 4 of the best Ute warriors would guide them. Chief Night Sky and the rest would stay behind to delay Hawkins, to buy them time. The children were brought, sleepy and frightened. As they prepared to leave, Eli realized something. The white doctor Chief Night Sky had mentioned, the one who was supposed to take the journal to the governor. He was still not here. He hadn't returned. If you take the cave path, the chief told him, you may meet him on the trail beyond. They slipped out of the village just as the eastern sky began to bleed with the first light of dawn. They followed a narrow game trail that climbed steeply into the mountains, disappearing into a dark fissure in the rock face. The entrance to the caves. The passage was dark and harrowing. The air was cold and damp. They had been traveling for what felt like an eternity when Grey Wolf raised his hand, signaling them to stop. Ahead, a faint shaft of light pierced the darkness from a side passage. And silhouetted in that light, standing like a specter from a nightmare, was a figure Eli recognized instantly, broad-shouldered, imposing, with the unmistakable scar that traced its way down his face. It was Sherman Wade. Captain Morgan, Wade called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. It's been a long time. Behind Wade, 2 of his Ute scouts raised their rifles, their aim steady. They were trapped. The secret path known only to the healers had led them right into the hands of the one man they were trying to escape. The doctor who was supposed to help them hadn't just failed to return. He'd never been gone. He had been a phantom, a lie, and they had walked right into his trap. Colonel, Eli acknowledged, his voice dangerously calm. He subtly signaled Grey Wolf and the other warriors to hold their fire. In the narrow cave, a single gunshot could bring the whole mountain down on top of them. Wade stepped forward into the dim light, and Eli felt a chill run down his spine. It was the same man he had followed into battle, the same commanding presence, but something in his eyes had changed. They were colder, emptier. The fire of the idealist had been replaced by the ice of a tyrant. "I'm disappointed, Morgan," Wade said, his tone one of genuine regret. "After everything we went through, after everything I did for you, this is how you repay my loyalty?" Loyalty? The word was a bitter taste in Eli's mouth. Was slaughtering innocent settlers loyalty to the country we fought for? Was murdering a United States senator loyalty? "Progress demands sacrifice," Wade said, as if explaining a simple truth to a child. "A few lives are a small price to pay for the future of this nation. History will vindicate me." "History is written by men of conscience." Sarah's voice cut through the tension. She was weak, swaying in her saddle, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "Something you clearly know nothing about." Wade's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. "Miss Carpenter," he said almost gently, "your father was a fool. He stood in the way of destiny." He turned back to Eli. "Surrender the journal and the woman, Morgan. No one else needs to get hurt. I'm calling in my debt." "I took a Confederate bayonet for you, Wade," Eli said, his voice low and intense. "I would have died for you on that field. That debt is paid in blood. But there are other debts. The debt we owe to the oath we swore, to protect this country and all its people. Not just the rich and the powerful." Wade was silent for a long moment, studying Eli as if seeing him for the first time. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I always knew you had conviction, Morgan. It's why I valued you." His hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. "It's also why I knew this wouldn't end easily." From the shadows behind Wade, more of his men appeared, blocking the passage ahead. They were completely, utterly trapped. "There's nowhere to go," Wade said. "Give me the journal. I give you my word, the woman will receive medical care. The children will be looked after. And you, Morgan, you can walk away. Go back to your ranch. We'll call the debt paid in full." It was a tempting offer, a way out. But Eli looked at Sarah, at the terrified faces of the children, and he knew he couldn't take it. Then a single gunshot echoed from deeper within the cave system, from the direction they had just come. It was followed by shouting. Wade's head snapped toward the sound, his face a mask of confusion. It was the only chance they would get. "Ride!" Eli yelled, spurring his horse forward, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. "Back to the village!" The narrow cave erupted into chaos. Wade's scouts fired, the sound deafening. One of the Ute warriors cried out, clutching his shoulder. Eli's sudden charge forced Wade to dive out of the way, clearing the path for an instant. Grey Wolf and the others surged past him, the children clinging to them for dear life. They galloped back the way they had come, bullets ricocheting off the stone walls around them. They burst out of the cave entrance and into the gray morning light, only to find a new kind of hell waiting for them. Hawkins had launched his attack. The Ute village was burning. Warriors were fighting desperately to defend their homes as Wade's men, a mix of white mercenaries and renegade Ute, swarmed through the lodges, firing indiscriminately. Grey Wolf veered toward a narrow ravine, a possible escape route. But as they neared it, a group of riders appeared, blocking their path. It was Hawkins himself, a cruel, triumphant smile on his scarred face. "End of the trail, Morgan," he called out. They were caught. Wade's men were behind them in the cave. Hawkins was in front of them, and the village was a raging inferno around them. Eli made the only choice he could. He lifted the smallest Swedish child from his saddle and handed her to Grey Wolf. "Take the children," he ordered. "Find a way through. We'll create a diversion." His eyes met Sarah's. She understood. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. As Grey Wolf and the warriors disappeared into the chaos with the children, Eli and Sarah did the last thing Hawkins would ever expect. They charged. They rode straight at Hawkins and his men, guns blazing. It was a suicidal, desperate move. Hawkins's men fired, bullets whistling past their ears. Eli felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed his arm. Sarah, with a strength he didn't know she possessed, drew a small derringer from her coat and fired back. The sheer audacity of their attack created a moment of confusion. It was all they needed. Eli reined his horse hard to the left, towards a steep, rocky embankment. They slid down the slope in a shower of dirt and loose rock, landing on a lower trail that led away from the burning village. Behind them, they could hear Hawkins shouting orders, organizing the pursuit. But for now they were free. They rode hard, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the massacre. But the exertion was too much for Sarah. She swayed in the saddle, her eyes rolling back, and then she slipped, falling sideways. Eli managed to catch her, pulling her onto his own horse, cradling her against his chest. She was unconscious again, her body limp, her fever raging. "Hold on," he urged, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Just hold on." The trail wound through the rugged wilderness, and by midday, Eli knew he was in trouble. Sarah was fading, and he was lost. He had to find shelter, and he had to find it now. The trail opened into a small clearing, and through the trees, he saw it. A cabin. Smoke was curling from its stone chimney. He approached cautiously, his revolver in his hand. The occupant could be anyone. A prospector, a trapper, an outlaw. But he was out of options. He dismounted, holding Sarah in his arms, and kicked the cabin door. Before he could knock, it swung open. A bearded man in his 60s stood there, his eyes keen and his hands steady. He looked from Eli to the unconscious woman in his arms, and then he said the last thing Eli ever expected to hear. "I've been expecting you," the man said calmly. "Wildflower's messenger pigeon reached me yesterday. I'm Dr. Hayes. Bring her inside, quickly." Eli stared at the man, stunned into silence. A messenger pigeon? The white doctor living with the Ute? He was real, after all. Chief Knight Sky hadn't been lying. But that meant... How did Wade know about the cave? Eli asked, his mind reeling. How did he know we'd be there? Dr. Hayes's face was grim. "Because the betrayal didn't come from a phantom doctor, Captain Morgan," he said, holding the door open. "It came from someone inside the village. One of Chief Knight Sky's own warriors sold you out for a box of rifles." The web of Wade's corruption was more insidious, more far-reaching than he had ever imagined. And as he carried Sarah into the warmth and safety of the doctor's cabin, he knew that their escape was only a temporary reprieve. The hunt was far from over. Dr. Jonathan Hayes worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had chosen to heal it anyway. "Gunshot, several days old," he muttered as he cleaned Sarah's wound. "The infection is well established. Wildflower's poultice probably saved her life, but we'll need something stronger." Eli stood watch by the door, his hand never far from his revolver. He trusted the Ute, but after the betrayal, he trusted no one else. "You can relax, Captain," Hayes said without looking up. "If I meant you harm, I would have let Wade's men find you. They've been combing these mountains for days." "How do you know so much about this?" Eli demanded. Hayes paused, meeting Eli's gaze. "Because I was in the room when Sherman Wade gave the order to assassinate Senator Carpenter." The statement hit Eli like a physical blow. "You're one of his men." "I am Wade's personal physician when he's in the territory," Hayes corrected him. "A relationship I have cultivated for years. It allows me to monitor his activities, to warn the Ute when one of his surveying parties is actually a war party." "You're a spy," Eli realized. "I prefer concerned citizen," Hayes said with a thin smile. "After the war, I saw what men like Wade were doing to this country. I couldn't stop them with a gun, so I chose a different weapon: information." "I tried to warn your father, Miss Carpenter," he said, turning to Sarah, who had regained consciousness and was listening, her eyes wide. "But I was too late." He pulled a letter from a desk drawer. "You'll recognize his handwriting." Sarah took the letter. "It's real," she whispered to Eli. "He mentions the coding system for the journal. Only my father and I knew about that." Some of the tension left Eli's shoulders, but not all of it. "If you knew all this, why didn't you expose Wade yourself?" "With what proof?" Hayes countered. "My word against a celebrated war hero with senators in his pocket? I needed something concrete, something irrefutable." "The journal," Sarah said, her hand moving protectively to her coat. "Exactly," Hayes said, his expression growing grave. which is why Wade will burn this entire territory to the ground to get it back. He looked at Eli. The children, by the way, are safe. Grey Wolf got them to me an hour before you arrived. I've already sent them on to Silver Creek, to a Quaker family who will care for them. Relief washed over Eli, a rare and welcome feeling. So what now? Now, Hayes said, we finish what the senator started. We get that journal to Governor Rout. The roads to Denver are watched, Eli reminded him. Hayes smiled, a cunning, intelligent light in his eyes. Not all of them. There are ways known only to those of us who prefer to remain unseen. But first, you both need to rest. We leave at midnight. They traveled under the cover of a moonless night, following a barely there trail that only Hayes could see. By dawn, they were high in the mountains, the air thin and cold. From a rocky outcropping, they could see the smoke still rising from the Ute village in the distance. And closer, much closer, they saw the dust cloud of riders moving fast on their trail. Hawkins, Hayes said, his voice grim. Wade's bloodhound. He never gives up. How far to Silver Creek? Eli asked. 20 miles the way we're going. We can make it by nightfall if we push. He glanced at Sarah, who was pale and trembling with exhaustion. I'll make it, she said, her voice a thin thread of steel. Eli pulled her onto his horse, holding her in front of him. They pushed on, traversing a precarious ridge with a sheer drop on one side. By midday, they had begun their descent into the valley where Silver Creek lay nestled among the pines. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. Wade has divided the town, Hayes explained, those who see his railroad as salvation and those who fear being crushed by it. As they neared the first farms, a rifle shot cracked across the valley. It wasn't close, but it was a clear warning. They had been spotted. They galloped for the cover of a cottonwood grove, another shot kicking up dirt behind them. They crossed a shallow creek and cut through a cornfield, the tall stalks hiding them from view. They were making for a farmhouse that Hayes knew belonged to a man named James Peterson, a farmer who had been fighting Wade's attempts to buy his land for years. Peterson met them on his porch, a rifle in his hand. Wade's men were here yesterday, he said after Hayes explained their situation, asking questions, making threats. I told them to get off my land. He spat on the ground. Come inside, the wife will see to you. The farmhouse was a haven of warmth and safety. Hannah Peterson, a woman with kind eyes and strong hands, immediately took charge of Sarah, but their respite was short-lived. James Peterson returned from a quick ride into town, his face grim. The town is crawling with them, he reported. 20, maybe 30 of Wade's men, and the sheriff has deputized them. They're telling everyone they're hunting the senator's murderers. He's turned it into a manhunt, Eli realized, with us as the fugitives. It's clever, Hayes admitted. If we're branded as criminals, the journal becomes inadmissible. There's a back way into town, Hannah Peterson said suddenly. An old mining tunnel. It runs from an abandoned claim all the way to the basement of the church. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. Hayes would ride openly into town, creating a diversion, drawing Hawkins and his men. Eli and Sarah would take the tunnel, meet with the town's preacher, and get to the telegraph office, which was run by a woman named Martha Reynolds, a war widow who despised Wade. As dusk fell, they heard the sound of approaching riders, lots of them. The cellar, Peterson said, pulling open a hidden trap door. They scrambled into the darkness just as the riders entered the farmyard. They could hear the voices from above. It was the sheriff, and with him another voice, smooth and cold and utterly confident. It was Sherman Wade. Mr. Peterson, Wade's voice drifted down to them. Your reluctance to cooperate suggests you may be harboring criminals. That would make you an accessory to murder. I know the law, Wade, Peterson replied, his voice steady. You have a warrant? The law can be interpreted broadly in times of emergency, Wade said, and murderers on the loose certainly qualifies. Eli's hand was on his gun, but Hayes stopped him. Revealing themselves now would only get the Petersons killed. There was a long, tense standoff, but eventually Wade relented. We will continue our search elsewhere, he announced. But Peterson, if you do see these people, remember the woman may look innocent, but she is dangerous, and her companions are a renegade doctor and a former soldier with a history of violence. The sound of the riders departing left a heavy silence in the farmhouse. "He's gone," Peterson said, opening the trapdoor. But he wasn't convinced. "He's planning something." They had to move, now. Peterson hid them under a pile of hay in his wagon and drove them to the entrance of the abandoned mine. The tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. They followed the main shaft, Hayes's lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Then Eli heard it, a faint scraping sound from the tunnel behind them, a dislodged stone, or a footstep. He doused the lantern, plunging them into absolute blackness. "Someone's following us," he whispered. They waited, their hearts pounding in the suffocating darkness. They heard footsteps approaching, saw the faint glow of lanterns. 3 of Wade's men. "They split up here," a voice said. "Tracks lead down the middle tunnel. Let's go." As the lights receded, Eli breathed a sigh of relief. But something wasn't right. He relit the lantern. Their tracks were clear in the damp earth, but someone had deliberately scuffed them out and created a false trail leading down the center tunnel. "Someone is helping us," Sarah whispered. "Or leading us into a different trap," Eli countered grimly. They took the left-hand tunnel, a passage Peterson had said was a dead end. It led them into a vast natural cavern, glittering with crystal formations. And there, on the far side, was another passage, one that hadn't been on any of Peterson's maps. Markings on the wall indicated it connected to the basement of the Silver Creek Bank. The passage ended at a solid brick wall. They were trapped. "It's a false wall," Eli discovered, prying at the bricks with his knife. "A secret entrance." They worked frantically, creating a small opening. Eli crawled through first into the bank's vault antechamber. They had made it. They were inside the town. They crept through the darkened bank and out a rear door into an alleyway. The telegraph office was just 2 buildings down, but the alley was crawling with Wade's patrols. "The rooftops," Eli whispered. They scrambled up a fire ladder onto the flat roof of the bank and made their way across the connected buildings, moving like ghosts in the night. They found a small maintenance door on the roof of the telegraph office. Hayes knocked a quiet, coded rhythm. The door opened, and a silver-haired woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's pulled them inside. It was Martha Reynolds. "I've been worried sick," she said. "Wade's men are everywhere. They're watching the office day and night." "We have to get a message to the governor," Sarah said, handing her the journal. "I can try," Martha said, her jaw set with determination. "I sometimes come down late to send routine messages. It might not arouse suspicion." She went downstairs. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Eli watched from the upstairs window as Wade's men patrolled the street below. Then a shout from the street, running footsteps, and the shattering crack of a gunshot. Eli was down the stairs in a flash. The front window of the telegraph office was shattered. Martha stood by the telegraph key, her small derringer aimed at the door. "They saw me," she said, her voice steady. "The message went through. Most of it. Enough for the governor to understand." The front door splintered as a heavy weight crashed against it. "Upstairs," Eli ordered. "Get Sarah and Hayes out through the roof. I'll hold them off." He overturned a heavy desk, creating a makeshift barricade. The door burst open, and Wade's men charged in. Eli opened fire. He fought his way back to the stairs, the rifle in his hands bucking against his shoulder. He raced up to the apartment. It was empty. He followed them onto the roof just as a bullet splintered the doorframe next to his head. John Hawkins stood there, a smoking revolver in his hand, a predator's grin on his face. "Nowhere left to run, Morgan," he snarled. Eli dove behind a chimney as Hawkins opened fire. He was pinned down, separated from the others. He made a split-second decision. He broke from cover and sprinted across the roof, drawing Hawkins' fire, leading him away from the others. He leaped across the gap to the next building, then the next, a desperate acrobatic chase across the rooftops of Silver Creek. He led them on a wild chase, drawing all the attention to himself, giving Sarah and the others the time they needed to escape. Finally, he vaulted down to street level, landing in an alley. He stepped out onto the main street, his revolver in his hand, and found himself face to face with Sherman Wade. The street went silent. Wade's men surrounded him, their guns trained on him. "It's over, Wade," Eli called out, his voice ringing in the sudden quiet. "The governor knows everything. It's only a matter of time." Wade dismounted, his face a cold, unreadable mask. "I saved your life once, Morgan," he said, his voice low. "A debt that can never be repaid. And yet, here you stand." "Here I stand," Eli agreed. Just then a thunder of hooves echoed from the end of the street. A dozen men in the blue uniforms of the Colorado militia were riding into town at a full gallop. And with them, more riders. Ute warriors, led by Chief Night Sky and Grey Wolf. And riding between them were Dr. Hayes, Martha Reynolds, and Sarah. Safe. Wade's men shifted nervously, suddenly outnumbered. "Sherman Wade," the militia captain called out, "by order of Governor Rout, you are under arrest for the murder of Senator William Carpenter." The jig was up, but Wade's hand remained on his pistol, his eyes locked with Eli's. For a moment it seemed the street would run with blood. Then, without warning, Hawkins, who had finally made it down to the street, raised his own gun, aiming it straight at Sarah. "The Journal is the problem," he screamed. "Let's get rid of the problem." Eli fired. He didn't even think. His gun was in his hand, and it bucked. And Hawkins staggered backward and fell, his face a mask of surprise. In the same instant, Wade's pistol discharged. But in that split second, his aim had shifted. The bullet kicked up the dust at Eli's feet. A final, inexplicable act. A flicker of the man he once was. Or maybe just a missed shot. Wade looked at Hawkins's body, then back at Eli. He slowly holstered his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. As the militia moved in, Wade paused beside Eli. "This isn't the end, Morgan," he said quietly. "Men like me built this nation. Men like me will always rise again." "Perhaps," Eli replied, "but men like Senator Carpenter will always be there to stand against you. And next time, I'll be standing with them from the start." The trial was a sensation. Wade was convicted, his empire crumbling to dust. His powerful friends in the East abandoned him, scattering like rats from a sinking ship. A month later, Eli Morgan stood on the porch of a new house on the edge of Denver. He had accepted the governor's offer to become a territorial marshal. Sarah came and stood beside him, her arm linking with his. She was now the governor's special advisor, continuing her father's work, ensuring that the future of Colorado was built on justice, not greed. "Do you miss it?" she asked, knowing he was thinking of his isolated ranch. "The solitude sometimes," he admitted, "but not as much as I would have missed this." The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. He thought of the debts that had defined his life. The debt to Wade, which he had finally repaid, not with loyalty, but with justice. The debt to her father, which he would spend the rest of his life honoring. And the new debt, the one he was just beginning to understand. The debt he owed to the woman standing beside him, who had shown him that a man could be more than just the sum of his past. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked out at the horizon, at the vast, promising landscape of their future. "That everyone deserves a final breath," he said softly, "a last chance to become who they were always meant to be." Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "Then breathe deep, Marshal Morgan," she murmured. "Our journey is just beginning." And as the last light faded from the sky, they stood together, two survivors of a storm, ready to face the dawn. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the incredible tales we have coming up next. Let us know in the comments below. At what point did you realize who the real villain was? Until next time, stay safe out there.